This is I'm Stuck, and today we are starting our Tudor series. And we will be learning about, first of all, the man who started this Tudor dynasty, Henry Tudor, later known as Henry VII. And in this particular video, we'll be learning about how he became the King of England, despite the fact that he had an incredibly weak claim to the throne. So we'll firstly talk about this weak claim to the throne, because it was incredibly weak. It came from his mother, who was Margaret Beaufort, and she was just a descendant of Edward III from the marriage of Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt. Now, if you think about just a descendant, that is incredibly weak. Now, this was even weakened because Catherine Swynford was not married when John Beaufort, who was Henry's great-grandfather, was born. So, seeing as no one was really born, you can see how sketchy this claim to the throne is. The other part of royalty, which I'll say is a little bit more clear-cut, but still very weak, came from Owen Tudor, which was Henry's grandfather. And Henry's grandmother had been married to Henry V. Obviously, Henry V was a man who was best known for Harfleur and Agincourt, particularly. But she was married, his grandfather was married to Henry V before she married Owen Tudor. But Owen Tudor wasn't any part of royalty. He was just a lowly man who just married someone who had previously been married to a king. So really not much loyalty in his thing, and his claim to the throne wasn't the strongest. So if we now learn about the life of Henry Tudor, and Henry was born in 1457 as the son of Edmund Tudor, who was the Earl of Richmond. Now, the only reason he was the Earl is because of these weak links to the throne they had. However, Edmund Tudor actually died a few months before his son's birth, and Henry grew up with his mother, as we mentioned before, Margaret Beaufort, and Jasper Tudor, who was his uncle, who would play a big part in his life, as we will see later on. Now, during the War of the Roses, which was this big event going on between the Yorkist house and the Lancastrian house, many of the Lancastrians had died, and Henry soon became the leading claimant to the throne in this Lancastrian house. Now, this meant that Jasper Tudor, his uncle, as we've mentioned before, took Henry to France to keep him safe, and Henry ended up living in Brittany for 14 years, until Edward IV died in 1483. Now, there's no evidence that in this time Henry actually tried to take the throne or tried to do any attempt to dissettle England. It's just that's his paranoia that someone might be wanting to take the throne, as there always was in this time period during the War of the Roses. So, when Edward died, Richard III, who was Edward IV's brother, seized control of the country. Now, he did this by locking up Edward V and Richard, who were his nephews, in the Tower of London. Now, this is known as the Princess of the Tower, and this is a famous story of how he locked them up and they were never seen again. They were thought to have been killed. And this kind of meant that when he came to the throne, when Richard III came to the throne, there was a lot of opposition to the country. And at first, Henry Tudor supported the rebellion of the Duke of Buckingham, who rebelled against Richard III. However, this rebellion ended up failing, so Henry decided that in order to have any success, he would have to try it himself. Now, when he decided this, Henry was living in Paris. So he built up a following of people who disliked Richard III, such as people like the Earl of Oxford and his uncle Jasper Tudor. Now, an important part was that he also gained financial support from Charles VIII. And Charles VIII was French, and he hoped that a war in England would distract Richard III from offering assistance to the Duke of Burgundy. So this wasn't done because he just liked Henry the Seventh or Henry Tudor. It was all done simply because of his own needs and because he wanted to distract Richard from Burgundy, which at the time was an independent state. So now it comes down to the main part, the big battle of the War of the Roses, the final battle of the War of the Roses. And this is the Battle of Bosworth, which took place in August 1485. So on the 1st of August 1485, Henry set sail from France, where he landed in Pembroke in Wales. Now, as he marched towards the English border, he gained support from many people. Now, one of the examples of this support was from the powerful Welsh landowner Rhys ap Thomas, and this person supported him on the condition that if Henry was to win the Battle of Bosworth and become the king, he would become the Lieutenant of Wales. So, on the 22nd of August, Henry's sort of bigger army than before, but still not massive army, met Richard's army at Bosworth Field near Leicester. Now, Richard III at the start did have the advantage because he had the better position, he had arrived at the battle earlier, and he also had more men. However, he wasn't able to rely on all his men in his army. Lots of people didn't like Richard III. His rule was not liked by everyone. It meant that he couldn't rely on everybody. For example, one of the people who you will learn about later is Lord Thomas Stanley and the Stanley family. And although he was technically on Richard's side, he was reluctant to support him because he was keeping his son hostage as a way to get him to support him. However, he's also reluctant to support Henry because obviously if Henry VII is to lose, or Henry Tudor at the time is to lose, it would mean that he would be put in debt, he would have many problems with Richard III. So at the start of the battle, he simply just watched. Now, as the battle went on, it did look as if Richard was likely to be stronger, and so this meant that Henry Tudor asked the Stanleys for support. Now, despite nearly being killed by Richard III, Henry did manage to gain the Stanley support, and Richard was caught by surprise from this, and he was eventually thrown off his horse. Now, nevertheless, he did get a new horse, but when he rejoined the battle, he was killed in battle, and he is the last ever king to be killed in battle. Now, this meant that the royal forces fled, and Henry Tudor became the king aged 28 years of age. Now, even though he's won the Battle of Bosworth, he's overturned the odds, he's come from France, he's been a refugee all his life, and he's come over to England and he's gained the throne. Henry's main problem would be keeping the throne. He really did not want to end up like Richard III, who was killed in battle, and he knew that there would be opposition from the Yorkists, and in later videos we will learn about how he consolidated this power. However, just for a taster now, we do know that because his claim was weak and there was Yorkist opposition through people like the de la Pole brothers, who had a similar claim to the throne as Henry, and foreign opposition from people like Margaret of Burgundy, who had Edward IV's sisters, it would be extremely hard for him to keep this throne, as we will learn in later videos. However, Henry did have advantages as well. And one of these main advantages was because in the War of the Roses, many of his opposition had been killed, or he was also able to punish them for treason for fighting against him, but it seemed like they were fighting against the king. Now, many people also supported Henry because many people admired his leadership qualities. So even though he may have been a refugee and many people disliked him, he had won this battle and he had showed that he was a strong character, and this is kind of what England needed after 30 years of fighting. So thank you for watching this video. If you go to my website, you can see more videos, and keep on watching these Tudor videos, so please subscribe. And if you can also visit my Twitter, the link is below. Perfect, and see you soon. Bye. I got to you.